When they moved to Vermont, Christine and Charlie Billis thought they'd gotten away from it all.
They had rented an old farmhouse.
It's away from the city and all the noise.
But one small slip on a quiet country road would shatter everything.
The car hit the tree at high speed.
Christine survived.
She basically walked away from the accident.
But Charlie didn't.
He was not wearing a seatbelt. It's just like, well, your dad didn't make it.
The investigation immediately raised questions.
Why did this car just veer off the road and slam head-on into a tree?
Was it just a tragic accident?
She was on a lot of medication.
They think she may have had a seizure.
Or did their idyllic country life conceal something darker?
She'd killed my best friend.
She just snapped.
I just couldn't take it anymore.
Brownington, Vermont, September 22, 2009. It was a crisp fall day in Vermont's Northeast Kingdom, the picturesque region of forest-covered mountains and white-clapboard farmhouses just south of the Canadian border.
Probably the most beautiful part of the state. It's your postcard picture.
The colors would have been alive with the foliage changing.
But at around 4:15 that Tuesday afternoon, for one farm family outside the tiny village of 900, the peace and quiet of the countryside was about to be brutally interrupted.
The people who lived in the home said it was a loud crash, just this big boom.
And when the frightened family rushed outside, they found the source of the crash. A car had smashed into the huge oak tree in their front yard.
The car hit the tree with great force at high speed.
The car was heavily damaged.
The family called 911 and then managed to free the driver of the car, 42-year-old Christine Billis.
They're able to get her out easily because her side of the car is not as heavily damaged as the passenger side.
And while Christine appeared shaken by the crash, she had been extremely lucky.
Christine wasn't injured at all. She basically walked away from the accident.
But Christine's husband, 57-year-old Charlie Billis, was trapped inside the wreckage until emergency crews arrived on the scene.
Rescue crews had to use, the jaws of life to get Charlie out of the vehicle.
And even when they did get him out, the prognosis wasn't good.
And they weren't sure if he was going to make it.
Charles didn't have a seatbelt on.
He struck the windshield, the dashboard, the roof of the vehicle.
The cause of Charlie's injuries may have been obvious, but as the ambulance rushed him to the hospital, the emergency workers at the scene were left with a puzzle. What had caused the crash?
There were no skin marks. It shows that there was no intent to stop.
The weather conditions were clear.
But whatever else might have caused Christine to veer off the road was far less clear. And when it finally came out, Christine would find the truth about the crash far harder to walk away from. Born in 1967, Christine Skorker had grown up in Massachusetts, where her family could trace its roots to a local Native American tribe.
The tribe that my mom and I are from are Micmac.
She grew up in the Boston suburbs, part of a hardworking, blue-collar family.
They were very church-going people. They're Baptists, and that was a big part of their life.
Christine never went to college. Instead, she got married and had a daughter at 19 and another before turning 30.
I was actually born right in Boston.
Her marriage ended in divorce soon after, leaving the 30-year-old a single mom, struggling to raise a 2-year-old and a 10-year-old.
Christine never worked more than part-time here or there.
Entry-level jobs, McDonald's, things like that. But she always made sure that she provided for us.
Even if it meant she had to go without.
She would literally starve herself to make sure that her children ate that day.
And she always had faith that things would work out, which turned out to be true, more or less. It was Christine's faith that led her to Charlie Billis in 1998. 15 years older than Christine, Charlie had spent most of his life in Massachusetts.
We grew up in the Boston area.
But unlike Christine, his roots weren't Native American.
Charles was originally from Greece.
and he'd come to America in search of a miracle.
Charles was blind as a child, and his parents took him from Greece to the United States to have an operation that would enable him to regain his sight.
The operation was a limited success.
He was technically legally blind, so he could see, but not very well.
But he more than made up for his disability in other ways.
Charlie was a real character. He was real smart.
And despite the fact that he was legally blind, Charlie even managed to make a modest living as a car salesman.
It was something he was really good at, talking people into things.
He was also very religious, which is how he first met Christine in 1998.
They met through the church, which is super cute to me.
And once Charlie met Christine, the smooth-talking car salesman quickly convinced the 31-year-old to go out on a date.
He was just a gentleman and a sweetheart, and she saw that.
One date led to another and another, and within a year, they were married.
My mom loved him.
So did her daughters.
I consider him my dad. I mean, he's raised me since I was a little girl.
He took interest in everything they did. I mean, he was a great guy with the kids.
Soon after the marriage, Christine, Charlie, and her 2 daughters moved to northern Vermont.
They had rented an old farmhouse.
It was outside the tiny village of Brownington,
We lived 20 miles from the nearest anything.
and that suited Charlie just fine.
My dad just fell in love with Vermont because it's so beautiful up here. It's quiet and it's away from the city and all the noise.
For the first few years, Charlie continued to work.
At a dealership in Orleans.
But while his modest salary continued to support the family, living in the country meant he relied on Christine's support more than ever.
Christine had to drive him everywhere. Without her, he wouldn't be able to get around.
Still, Christine appeared equally happy about the move. And within a year of their arrival in Vermont, she gave birth to a daughter, Charlie's first and her third.
She was a terrific mom. She really doted on her kids, never failed to give them a lot of hugs and tell them that she loved them.
She was just a great person. She was happy all the time. She was really involved with the people around her. She had friends. She's an active member of the church.
Changes were coming, though. By 2005, Christine's oldest daughter had grown up and moved out on her own. And Charlie left his part-time job as a car salesman.
The family relied on Charlie's disability check to survive.
Charlie wasn't one to sit around idle, though.
He wanted to remain active in the community.
So he started volunteering at NEK TV.
NEK TV is the local public education and government access channel.
In fact, Charlie didn't just volunteer. He was soon hosting his own offbeat show.
I'm your co-host, I guess, Charlie Billis.
He had a wicked sense of humor. He had a show called Public Forum, and he would interview people.
He loved being able to talk to people in the community about the issues.
And people loved talking to Charlie, too.
He was a great person to have a conversation with.
Never any notes. Everything was off the top of his head. He had an incredible memory. He was very sharp.
The show was a hit.
And it was pretty exciting.
For Charlie and Christine.
She'd put a lot of work into the productions and did the camera work and the editing and that stuff.
It really gave them something to focus on.
However, since it was strictly volunteer work, it didn't give them much to live on.
They were very poor. They were living on, a fixed income.
They'd never been well off. But with Charlie no longer selling cars, things were tighter than ever before.
The family was strapped for cash.
And by 2007, the family faced other challenges too. Although she'd only just turned 40, Christine was in poor health.
She was diabetic.
Worse, in the spring of 2009, she was diagnosed with ovarian cancer.
She had a total hysterectomy.
The operation was a success, and the cancer scare convinced Christine to make another positive change in her health, too.
She's trying to quit smoking. It was something that she had always really wanted to do, and she knew that it was a bad habit, and she wanted to be a good role model to us.
And this time, she had help.
She was prescribed the medication Chantix to help, quit.
As a result, by the afternoon of September 22nd, 2009, when she drove Charlie into the studio to tape the latest episode of his show, it seemed that things were once again looking up for Christine.
I could hear her laughing behind the camera.
And then, once the taping was done, Christine and Charlie got into her car and headed off into the late September afternoon.
Late September, the leaves are changing colors, especially in the northern part of the state. It's beautiful.
On this beautiful autumn day, they headed home towards Brownington.
But as Christine drove home on that gorgeous Vermont afternoon, her life with Charlie was about to come to a sudden, devastating end. On the afternoon of September 22nd, 2009, state troopers and local EMTs rushed to the scene of an accident outside the tiny Vermont village of Brownington.
There's this car that just slammed into a tree.
The driver of the car was 42-year-old Christine Billis.
She had some minor, certainly non-life-threatening injuries.
Although she did appear badly shaken by the impact.
She's convulsing. EMTs think she's going into shock.
Meanwhile, her husband, 57-year-old Charles Billis, was in far worse shape.
Charles was not wearing a seatbelt.
He is seriously injured.
Charles and Christine were both transported to North Country Hospital in Newport.
Not long after, the Highway Patrol notified Christine's teenage daughter, Karina, who had just gotten home from school.
The police showed up. The cop just comes in and was like, oh, your parents went off-road, which is, not a big deal. You think maybe they drove into a ditch or a tire popped or something.
But the highway patrolman hadn't finished.
And he's just like, well, your dad didn't make it.
Charles basically bled out at the scene.
And by the time he reached the ER, there was nothing the doctors could do.
The doctors try everything, but shortly after arrival, they pronounce him dead.
Charlie's stepdaughter was stunned by the news.
I'm like, how do I process this? I'm really confused.
But she did rush to the hospital to be with her mother, who was being kept under observation.
She just reached out her arms and was crying on my shoulder, and I'm still really confused.
So was her mother, who appeared more than a little disoriented after the ordeal.
The EMTs thought maybe she had a seizure leading up to the crash.
It would certainly explain her uncontrollable shaking and convulsions after the crash. But what about the crash itself?
Why did this car just veer off the road and slam head-on into a tree?
While Christine was in the ER, accident investigators from the Highway Patrol tried to determine what had caused the crash. And what they found appeared to defy explanation.
There were no skid marks.
The weather was fine.
It was dry. It was sunny.
And it wasn't a particularly dangerous stretch of road either.
It's a pretty straight road in that area. There's one tree right there on the side of the road.
In fact, Christine and Charlie had passed that way hundreds of times before.
It's a route they drove every day. It's not like this road was unfamiliar to them.
Given all that, the investigators at the scene had a hard time understanding just how Christine could have hit the tree, unless she'd been trying.
The police had suspicions about whether it had been an intentional crash.
However, by the time Charlie was buried a week later, most of the people who weren't privy to the details of the crash still assumed he died in a tragic car accident.
I attended the funeral. Folks were very sad. Our hearts went out to Christine and to his family.
But not everyone's hearts went out to Christine. Among her fellow volunteers at the TV station, the speculation was rampant.
Co-workers started going to the police saying, you might really want to take a closer look. Was this an accident? Or was this Christine killing Charlie on purpose?
According to their fellow volunteers, Christine and Charlie had been bickering lately.
They knew the Billises were having some marital problems.
They have had their moments where, they're both yelling.
Charlie had accused her of being lazy and whatnot.
Not that their arguing had appeared to be anything serious.
I just, shrugged it off. I thought it was just Charlie, complaining.
It was just because she was quitting smoking. That's what happens to people. They get grumpy and cranky.
But there was something else. An incident Charlie's friend Steve Merrill had been stewing over since the accident. According to what Steve told the state police, the incident had occurred about a month before the crash that killed Charlie.
Me and Chrissy were talking out back during a cigarette break.
And one of the things they talked about was a story that Steve hadn't thought much about at the time.
He had told her how his friend had committed insurance fraud.
But what was really interesting was how Steve's friend had pulled it off.
By crashing his car on purpose.
The car was a lemon. It was always in the garage, and the only way to get rid of it, in their eyes, was to total it.
And according to Steve, the details of the story, details he'd shared with Christine, sounded awfully familiar.
The driver had belted himself in, put on a full-face motorcycle helmet and a pillow, and driven it into a tree.
Was it possible that Steve's story had planted the seed of a murder plot? Charlie's friend was convinced.
She killed him. She did it intentionally.
But when Steve took his story to the state police, they were skeptical.
I'm going to take my car, and this is the perfect way to murder my husband without hurting myself. That makes no sense to me.
And they were hesitant to open a murder investigation based on a single conversation during a smoke break.
There was absolutely no evidence to substantiate suspicions that this crash was intentional.
Besides, there appeared to be a far more logical explanation for the crash. In June, only 3 months before the accident, Christine had been diagnosed with ovarian cancer and undergone a hysterectomy.
She was on a lot of medication.
Not only that, Christine's health problems had taken quite a toll on her emotions.
She was seeing a mental health counselor.
Christine was taking 2 different antidepressants.
The cancer scare had also caused her to try and quit smoking, leading her to take a drug called Chantix.
People take Chantix to quit smoking. There are other effects of it, but for the most part, it's to quit smoking.
And one of those other effects led to the final drug that Christine had started taking in the weeks leading up to the crash.
Chantix caused insomnia and some other things, which caused her to take the Ambien.
Ambien, Chantix, and the antidepressants. When combined, the drugs apparently produced some disturbing results.
Just made her kind of a different person. She used to be really bubbly. She would cook a lot. She's a great chef, would make the best soups, and after starting all these medicines they prescribed her, she just kind of fell out of it. She didn't really have interest in things anymore.
But did they do more than that? The day before the crash, Christine had gone to her doctor complaining about fatigue and drowsiness.
She was talking about having near accidents.
In fact, Christine claimed she'd been experiencing blackouts.
They was talking about actually driving and not actually remembering the path that she drove.
And as far as the state troopers conducting the investigation were concerned, that explained the crash.
The conclusions in the reports were that it was some kind of medical condition.
They think she may have had a seizure
that caused her to veer off the road and hit the tree.
In other words, case closed.
The coroner said it was an accident, and so did the accident report.
But in the months ahead, investigators would have reason to question that ruling. By January 2011, it had been more than a year since 43-year-old Christine Billis had smashed her car head-on into a tree outside rural Brownington, Vermont.
Police were a little suspicious about the crash. Why did this car go off the road?
Christine had suffered only minor injuries, but her husband, 57-year-old Charlie Billis, had been killed in the crash.
While she had her seatbelt on, Charlie did not. And of course, he went into the windshield and died shortly after the crash.
Officially, the crash had been ruled an accident.
Everyone assumed that Christine either fell asleep or had a seizure or something.
The day before the accident, Christine was actually at a sleep study doctor's appointment.
However, around NEK-TV, the public access station where Charlie and Christine had both volunteered, rumors persisted.
Well, she'd killed my best friend. I knew that she did it.
Despite hard feelings on the part of her fellow volunteers, Christine did her best to carry on as before.
After Charlie had been killed, she would show up at the studio and do some productions on her own.
And more than a year after her husband's death, the 43-year-old also had a new man in her life, Kevin Leland. Like Charlie, Kevin worked on the fringes of the media world.
He's a blogger. He loved blogging about crime stories online.
And he'd met Christine online, too, in August of 2010.
Christine and Kevin Leland met on a dating site called OkCupid.
Christine had a, really good sense of humor and was easy to talk to, especially online.
One of the first things Christine shared after meeting Kevin was the fact that she'd lost her husband almost a year earlier.
Christine told me that Charles died in a car accident.
An accident that she blamed on herself.
Christine said that she must have had a spell. She's a diabetic, and when she passed out behind the wheel, the car veered off and hit the tree.
And according to Kevin, she was still struggling to deal with the aftermath.
She was depressed.
She seemed devastated over the loss of her husband, said that he was a good guy.
But without Charlie in her life, Christine was lonely, which is what had brought her to OkCupid and Kevin.
They became friends. They talked on the phone.
And eventually, they met in person.
We shared a lot of laughs and got to know each other pretty quickly, I think.
However, according to Kevin, he and Christine had shared more than just laughs.
Reading her profile, OkCupid asks you about, what secret would you be willing to reveal online? And she says, well, nothing now, but once I get to know you, I'll tell you a little something, something.
And when she finally did trust Kevin enough to reveal her secret, Christine's little something would turn out to be huge. On January 14th, 2011, Kevin Leland made a phone call to Vincent Iluzzi, an NEK-TV volunteer, Vermont state senator, and county prosecutor.
In state politics, you receive all kinds of calls from all kinds of people. Some are legitimate, some are crackpots, and some are somewhere in between.
And when Kevin told Iluzzi why he was calling, the state senator figured he was just one more crackpot.
I told him that I had information regarding the murder of his friend, Charles Billis.
My initial reaction was highly skeptical, somewhat dismissive, because it came from someone I had never met, never spoken with, did not know.
Kevin asked Iluzzi to hear him out, though, explaining how he'd met Christine through the dating website.
She obviously fell for him. She trusted him.
So much so that over the last few months, she had opened up to him.
She indicated that she wasn't as happily married as she led me to believe she was at first.
And that admission, according to Kevin, had eventually led Christine to reveal the secret she'd hinted at in her online profile.
She just broke down sobbing, just said that I did it on purpose. I drove the car into the tree on purpose.
Not only had Christine supposedly confessed, Kevin claimed she'd told him why she'd done it.
She told me that he was abusive to both her and her daughters.
Kevin said that Christine had even taken him out to the crash site and walked him through the so-called accident.
She was talking about it almost with a sense of pride, like, look what I did.
It was an incredible story, if it was true.
I said, Mr. Leland, I'm a prosecutor, and in the criminal justice system, you need proof.
Proof that Kevin Leland claimed to have.
His response was, I have tape recordings.
I recorded her confessing.
I immediately told him to secure the tapes in a safe location, and I would have someone from the Vermont State Police get in touch with him
On January 21st, Kevin Leland met with an investigator from the Vermont State Police and played the tape he'd made of Christine's supposed confession.
He didn't seem shocked at all, and he indicated to me that they actually did have some suspicion, but nothing that they could act on.
But Kevin's tape changed all that.
That's enough evidence for them then to go get a warrant.
It wasn't an arrest warrant, though. Instead, it authorized the investigators to use Kevin as a confidential informant to record more conversations with Christine.
That first recording wasn't usable. It wasn't admissible because I didn't get it under a warrant.
And on February 13th, 2011, Kevin met with Christine and secretly recorded their conversation.
In this particular case, the state police relied on Mr. Leland to use his own digital recorder.
I kept it in my pocket.
It was crude, but it worked. On the tape, Christine once again admitted to crashing the car on purpose.
I was protecting myself and my kids. That's what I was doing.
She claimed Charlie had mentally abused her for years and that she just couldn't take it anymore.
I knew that was the only way.
Although according to Christine, the crash wasn't exactly premeditated. She claimed that she and Charlie had been arguing on the drive home when she saw the tree up ahead.
She just snapped and decided, it's time.
Christine said that when she saw that tree coming at her, it was one of the most beautiful things she'd ever seen.
According to Christine, it was supposed to be the last thing she ever saw, too.
Kevin, seriously, with all my true heart, I tell you this. When I hit that tree, I was expecting to be dead.
She claimed this was supposed to be a murder-suicide.
That's how bad it was. That I was fine with dying. I knew that if God said I had to die too, that he was going to take care of my kids. I weren't worried about it.
That's what Christine said on the tape. But would anyone else back up her abuse claims? Over the next few weeks, the state police investigators started looking into it.
You have witnesses that were saying that the two were always at each other.
However, no one claimed that their bickering had ever crossed the line.
In the year or two that I'd known and hung out with them, I hadn't seen any abuse.
Every couple is going to have their moments. They've never, laid a hand on each other.
Increasingly skeptical about Christine's abuse claims, the investigators decided it was time to confront her directly. On April 25th, they dropped by her house to ask a few questions, a visit she initially assumed had something to do with her insurance claim.
The insurance company said that they had to go through the court in order to be able to pay the claim.
Is this life insurance or auto insurance?
Auto insurance, $100,000.
There was a big chunk of insurance money.
Money that Christine appeared anxious to collect.
We've been going over this since the car crash.
Yeah.
And now it's April 11. What the heck?
But then, after allowing Christine to go on at length about her insurance troubles, the investigators told her the truth.
I'm going to be honest with you. I don't know what's going on with your insurance claim, nor have I spoken with your insurance adjuster or anything.
Right.
Then the investigator came right out and told Christine why he was there.
Have you ever told anyone that you intentionally crashed your car to kill your husband?
Hold on.
Yes.
Okay. Because I've listened to hours of phone calls.
He led her to believe that they tapped her phone and her computer, and that's how they knew the information.
And the investigators made it clear that they knew it all.
I heard you talk about at one point how you crashed the car and you didn't care whether you lived or died. You were going to let God decide the outcome. This is the stuff I've heard you say to other people.
Then, once letting her know just how much they had on her, the investigators offered Christine one more chance.
Do you have anything else you want to say?
Not at this moment.
Christine didn't have anything else to say to the investigators. But once they wrapped up their questions and left, she quickly got in touch with Kevin, unaware that he was cooperating with the state police.
She tells Kevin, quote, I'm busted.
She thought she was going to jail.
She wouldn't be going right away, though. Instead, the investigators let her stew for several weeks while they got their case in order. And by the beginning of June, she'd had enough. On June 6th, Christine contacted the investigators and requested they come back so she could give them a second, very different statement.
So I wasn't exactly truthful last time.
As she confessed outright.
Christine not only admitted that she had purposefully killed Charlie, she claimed that she'd had no choice.
Christine claimed that he was threatening physical abuse as well, that he threatened to kill her.
I just couldn't take it anymore.
She would rather not live than continue in this life.
I thought we were both gonna die.
And she claimed that she had initially been disappointed when she didn't die in the crash.
I remember thinking, can I do anything right?
But then, once she realized that Charlie was gone, Christine admitted that she'd felt relieved.
And at the hospital, I didn't hear him yelling at me. First time. In 10 years.
On June 6, 2011, it had been almost 2 years since Charlie Billis died in a bizarre car crash outside tiny Brownington, Vermont.
Charles and Christine headed home on Route 5A towards Brownington, and Christine veered into a tree and struck it.
Police were a little suspicious about the crash because she went straight into the tree. Without skid marks, there was no intent to stop.
And that afternoon, Christine had just confirmed what the state police and many of Charlie's friends had long suspected, that she had driven into a tree on purpose.
What was your intent of hitting that tree?
I thought we were both gonna die. That was what I thought was gonna happen.
Christine has tried to convince people that it was going to be a murder-suicide.
However, the state police had reason to doubt her.
She basically picked someone's brain who had crashed a truck purposely.
How the driver had belted himself in, padded themselves with pillows and a full-face motorcycle helmet. As soon as I told that story, it's like I could see the gears going in Chrissy's brain.
There was no evidence Christine had taken those extra precautions, but there was also no evidence to support her claim that Charlie had been abusive.
The guy didn't have an abusive bone in his body.
I'd never seen him be abusive to her at all, either physically or psychologically.
Instead, the state police believed that they had uncovered Christine's real motive for wanting Charlie dead, one that she had hinted at in her first interview with the police.
Well, the insurance company said that they had to go through the court in order to be able to pay the claim.
And her $100,000 auto insurance claim wasn't the only payout either.
Her children were the beneficiary of a life insurance policy.
It was a $300,000 insurance policy. There's the motive right there.
Her husband's death had also entitled her to collect survivor benefits from Social Security.
I think that she wanted to be free of him and get a check in the mail every month.
And then there were the kids to think about, too.
She wouldn't have to go through any kind of a divorce where her kids might be under his custody.
No messy custody dispute, a cash payout, and a confession. As far as the police and prosecutors were concerned, it all added up to one thing.
They had a case of premeditated murder.
There seemed to be mountains of evidence.
However, despite all the evidence they'd uncovered, the state police didn't arrest Christine just yet. Instead, after getting her confession on tape, they left.
He gave her, a few days to get her affairs in order.
That wasn't the only reason they'd held off on making an arrest, though, because for all their evidence, there were still some potential holes in the prosecution's case. One was the medication she'd been taking prior to the crash, a drug called Chantix.
People take Chantix to quit smoking.
However, since the crash, The drug had been at the center of a number of lawsuits alleging some potentially serious side effects, including some that could work to the defense's advantage.
Some of the adverse effects are psychosis, hallucination, paranoia, delusion, homicidal ideation, aggression, anxiety and panic, as well as suicidal ideation. All of these are on the black box warnings.
And that wasn't the only medication Christine had been taking. At the time of the crash, she'd also been taking a prescription sleep aid.
The FDA actually held that the dosage that Christine was taking was a harmful dose, that it was causing drowsy driving, and they ordered that any future prescriptions for that medication be cut in half immediately.
In addition to the possible complications presented by Christine's medications, the prosecutors also had reservations about the person who'd helped them secure Christine's confession, a blogger and self-styled social media reporter named Kevin Leland.
Kevin refers to this as his big scoop.
He was definitely after fame.
Was it possible he'd preyed on Christine? The defense was sure to suggest it.
It's clear he manipulated her. She was in a very fragile state. All of the mental health records show that she felt responsible for her husband's death.
Kevin denied manipulating Christine, but there were also questions about the tapes he had made of his conversations with her.
I've never seen an instance where the police rely on an informant to provide the recording device.
And that could make the prosecution's case vulnerable.
So there's no independent evidence of where the conversations took place and when they took place. There's no reliable date stamp on his digital recorder. The state can't prove that those conversations were obtained within the windows authorized by the warrant.
However, despite their reservations, the Orleans County District Attorney's Office gave a green light to the arrest on June 28th.
She was just crying, and I'm like, what's wrong? And she's just like, I'm going away.
And then Christine turned herself in, still completely unaware that her friend Kevin was the one who'd led the police to her.
I drove her to the station.
Not only that, but he sat with her while the state police completed the booking process.
I prayed with her, and they let her, go out and smoke a cigarette, and then I left, and they took her away.
She was charged with first-degree murder.
On November 2nd, 2012, Christine Billis was led into a Newport, Vermont courtroom. The 45-year-old mother of three had been accused of killing her husband Charlie in September of 2009 by intentionally ramming their car into a tree.
She was charged with first-degree murder, and she was facing life in prison.
However, shortly before she was scheduled to stand trial, the case had taken an abrupt turn.
Kevin Leland got caught trying to enter the U.S. from Canada with several narcotics in his possession, as well as a loaded .357 Magnum and a marijuana pipe.
That's going to raise some serious doubts about his credibility in the minds of the jury.
And that was on top of his other drawbacks as a witness.
He had blogged about his role in this extensively, and he had indicated that he wanted to make money off it.
That's not the type of person you want as your star witness at trial.
The prosecution quickly realized that their case was unraveling.
So in July of 2012, the prosecutors had approached Christine with a possible plea deal.
It was a plea deal for manslaughter. That was a huge surprise.
Christine took the deal.
She enters a plea ultimately of guilty to involuntary manslaughter.
As a defense attorney, where a client is looking at life, a deal that nets somebody less than that is usually considered to be a good deal.
And she was in court that November morning for her sentencing.
This is Christine's last chance for any type of leniency from the judge. This is a chance for her to explain herself and what led up to her decision.
But it was a chance she refused to take.
She didn't say a word. She didn't even say she was sorry.
Instead, she listened in silence as the judge sentenced her to serve 7 to 15 years in prison.
We have indeterminate sentencing here in Vermont, so you get a minimum and a maximum.
Most people don't do the max.
Which was a bitter disappointment for many of Charlie's friends.
She only gets 7 years. I don't think it even remotely constitutes justice. It's a travesty.
This was planned in advance. It was intentional. It was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. And so I think she got off very lightly.
Light or not, Charlie's friends can at least take comfort in the fact that she's in prison.
She almost got away with the perfect crime, and the only reason she got caught was because she opened her mouth.
But did she get caught because she was guilty? Or was it, as her daughter believes, because she had confided in the wrong person?
My personal point of view is that my mother is now in jail because Kevin saw the opportunity and he went for it.
She didn't say I intended to, like I meant to do it on purpose. But he convinced her that she did.
On the afternoon of September 1st, 1980, inside the Italian embassy in Beirut, two journalists stopped before leaving for what appeared to be another routine day of reporting. They had already spent days moving through one of the most dangerous cities in the world, arranging meetings, gathering information, and navigating a landscape where political alliances changed as quickly as the sounds of gunfire echoing across the streets. Yet before walking away from the embassy, they made a remark that would echo across more than 4 decades of unanswered questions. According to later accounts, they told embassy personnel, "If we don't come back within 3 days, come looking for us." It was not an emotional farewell. It was not a dramatic declaration intended to leave an impression. It sounded more like a practical instruction from two experienced reporters who understood exactly where they were and exactly how dangerous their next appointment could become. At the time, no one could have imagined that those words would become the final documented warning before one of Italy's greatest modern mysteries. The following morning, September 2nd, 1980, Graziella DePalo and Italo Toni left the Triumph Hotel in West Beirut. Witnesses reported that they climbed into a Jeep. They told others they were heading south to meet a source. After that, the historical record falls into silence. No verified witness ever confirmed seeing either journalist alive again. No confirmed telephone calls were made. No letters arrived. No photographs surfaced. No financial transactions provided investigators with a trail to follow. Their bodies were never recovered. No one has ever been convicted of kidnapping or murdering them. More than 40 years later, investigators, historians, journalists, and their families are still searching for answers that have never come. Some disappearances begin with a crime scene. Others begin with a confession, a witness, or physical evidence that investigators can follow from one clue to another. This case began with almost nothing. The disappearance itself became the mystery. There was no confirmed location where violence had occurred, no forensic evidence to examine, no reliable eyewitness account describing what happened after the pair departed their hotel. Instead, investigators faced an absence so complete that it became one of the defining characteristics of the case. Every unanswered question only revealed another layer of uncertainty. Did they reach the meeting they intended to attend? Were they intercepted before arriving? Did they unknowingly walk into a trap? Or did they meet individuals who believed the journalists possessed information too dangerous to become public? These questions have been debated for decades, but none has ever received a definitive answer supported by conclusive evidence. Their disappearance did not happen in isolation. To understand why this case still resonates across Italy, it is necessary to return to the world they entered in the late summer of 1980. Lebanon was then in the midst of a devastating civil war that had begun 5 years earlier. Beirut, once celebrated as one of the Mediterranean's great cultural capitals, had become a fractured city divided among competing military forces and political organizations. Different neighborhoods answered to different authorities. Palestinian organizations controlled significant areas of West Beirut. Syrian forces maintained their own presence. Christian militias held other districts. Numerous armed groups operated simultaneously, while foreign intelligence agencies watched, negotiated, recruited, and sometimes intervened from the shadows. The city had become a crossroads where local conflicts overlapped with international rivalries born from the Cold War and the broader struggle for influence throughout the Middle East. For journalists, Beirut represented both an extraordinary opportunity and an extraordinary danger. Stories unfolded there every day that affected governments far beyond Lebanon's borders. Arms shipments crossed the region through complicated networks involving multiple countries. Political negotiations often took place behind closed doors. Public statements rarely revealed the entire truth. Experienced correspondents understood that official explanations were only one part of a much larger picture. Investigative reporting demanded conversations with people operating outside government press offices. People whose names rarely appeared in newspapers, but whose decisions could alter regional politics. Such reporting also carried enormous risks. Information itself could become dangerous. Simply asking the wrong questions in the wrong place could attract unwanted attention from organizations determined to protect their secrets. Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni understood those risks better than most. Neither was an inexperienced traveler accidentally caught in a conflict. Graziella DiPaolo, despite being only 24 years old, had already established herself as an ambitious investigative journalist, willing to examine subjects many others avoided. She contributed to the Italian newspapers Paese, Sera, and Astrolabio, focusing on international arms trafficking, Palestinian organizations, intelligence services, and the complex relationship between Italy and the Middle East, rather than relying exclusively on official statements. She sought primary sources and first-hand information. Colleagues later remembered her determination to pursue facts directly, even when doing so required entering politically sensitive environments. Beside her stood Italo Toni, born nearly 3 decades earlier in 1927, where Graziella represented youthful determination. Toni brought years of experience covering the Middle East. He had reported on Lebanon's conflicts before and had developed contacts among numerous political and military factions operating throughout the region. His familiarity with Beirut's complicated political landscape gave him access that few foreign journalists possessed. Together, they formed a partnership that combined investigative persistence with regional expertise. They were not tourists wandering into unfamiliar territory. They knew they were working in one of the world's most dangerous environments. That awareness makes the warning delivered at the Italian embassy especially striking. If we don't come back within 3 days, come looking for us. Those words suggest neither panic nor certainty that something terrible would happen. Instead, they reflect professional caution. Journalists working in conflict zones often inform colleagues or diplomatic officials about planned meetings, especially when meeting confidential sources. Such precautions could provide a starting point if communication unexpectedly ceased. Whether Graziella and Italo sensed a specific threat or were simply following prudent professional practice remains unknown. The available evidence cannot answer that question. Yet their statement has become inseparable from the story because history transformed it into a haunting prelude to disappearance. In the decades that followed, investigators would repeatedly return to those final documented hours, examining every available record in an attempt to reconstruct their movements. The chronology itself appears deceptively simple. On August 22, 1980, the two journalists had traveled to Damascus before continuing to Beirut. Their trip received assistance from Nimr Hamad, who served as the Palestine Liberation Organization's representative in Italy. They stayed at the Triumph Hotel in West Beirut, an area controlled by Palestinian forces during the Civil War. Their reporting focused on refugee camps, international arms routes, relations between Palestinian organizations and Italy, and the possibility that unofficial political understandings existed between Italian authorities and the Palestine Liberation Organization. According to later accounts from colleagues and subsequent documentation, Graziella became particularly interested in investigating arms shipments from Italy to the Middle East. The activities of Italian intelligence services in Beirut, extremist Palestinian groups, and alleged secret agreements involving the Italian government. Exactly what information the pair collected remains unknown. No surviving notebook or verified cache of documents has revealed the full extent of their findings. This uncertainty has fueled speculation for decades. Yet speculation alone cannot substitute for evidence. Historians continue to distinguish carefully between documented investigative interests and assumptions about what the journalists may actually have discovered. The distinction matters because the disappearance has often attracted theories reaching far beyond what available evidence can support. Throughout this story, one principle remains essential. Facts must remain separate from hypotheses. The verified facts tell us that Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni traveled to Lebanon to investigate politically sensitive subjects. They warned embassy officials that someone should look for them if they failed to return within 3 days. They left their hotel on September 2nd to meet a source in southern Lebanon. They were never reliably seen again. Their bodies have never been found. No individual has ever been convicted in connection with their disappearance. Everything beyond those established points requires careful examination. Some investigative theories have stronger evidentiary support than others. But none has resolved the central question that has haunted Italy since 1980. What happened after that Jeep disappeared into the streets of Beirut? Cases like this endure because they exist at the intersection of personal tragedy and historical uncertainty. On one level, this is the story of two journalists who vanished while pursuing difficult reporting. Their families have spent decades without certainty, without graves to visit, and without the closure that accompanies even the most painful confirmed truth. On another level, the case touches broader themes that continue to shape discussions of modern Italian history. Intelligence operations, international diplomacy, arms trafficking, state secrecy, and the complicated political relationships forged during the Cold War. Over time, the disappearance of Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni came to symbolize something larger than the fate of two missing reporters. It became one of Italy's enduring mysteri d'Italia, those unresolved national mysteries where politics, violence, and secrecy overlap so completely that even decades of investigation cannot fully separate one from another. More than 40 years have now passed since the morning they left the Triumph Hotel. Governments have changed. Wars have ended. Documents have been declassified. Prosecutors have reopened investigations. Historians have revisited old evidence with fresh perspective. Yet despite every effort, the silence that began on September 2nd, 1980, has never truly been broken. Their final warning still hangs over the case like an unanswered question, reminding us that sometimes history is not defined by what we know, but by what vanished before anyone had the chance to record the truth. Every unresolved disappearance begins long before the final confirmed sighting. It begins with ordinary lives, personal ambitions, professional decisions, and a series of choices that seem entirely reasonable until history looks back and recognizes the moment where everything changed. The disappearance of Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni cannot be understood simply by examining the morning of September 2nd, 1980, to appreciate why their case became one of Italy's most enduring mysteries. It is first necessary to understand who they were, what kind of work they believed in, and why the world they entered during the late summer of 1980 was unlike almost any other place on Earth. Their names are often spoken together because history forever linked them through a shared disappearance. Yet they arrived at that journey from remarkably different stages of life. One represented the confidence and determination of a young investigative journalist eager to pursue difficult stories. The other embodied decades of experience earned through reporting in regions where conflict had become part of everyday existence. Their partnership reflected a combination of curiosity and expertise, qualities that made them exceptionally capable of covering complicated international events, but perhaps also placed them closer to sensitive information than many outside observers realized at the time. Graziella DiPaolo was born in Rome in 1955 by the standards of Italian journalism. She was still at the beginning of what appeared to be a promising career. When she disappeared, she was only 24 years old. Yet youth should not be mistaken for inexperience. During her relatively short career, she had already demonstrated a willingness to investigate subjects that many reporters approach cautiously. She collaborated with the Italian newspapers Paese, Sera, and Astrolabio, publications known for engaging with political and investigative reporting, rather than limiting herself to domestic stories. Graziella increasingly focused on international issues whose consequences extended far beyond Italy's borders. Her work concentrated on international arms trafficking, Palestinian organizations operating throughout the Middle East, intelligence services, and the complex political relationships connecting Italy with events unfolding across the region. These were not simple subjects that could be understood through official press conferences or government statements. They required patience, travel, and conversations with individuals whose perspectives were often unavailable through conventional sources. Contemporary accounts and later recollections from colleagues describe Graziella as someone determined to reach original sources whenever possible, instead of accepting official explanations at face value. She preferred to verify information independently. That approach reflected the central principles of investigative journalism, but also carried significant risks. In politically unstable environments, asking questions could itself become dangerous. Seeking confirmation from people involved in sensitive activities inevitably exposed journalists to individuals whose interests might conflict with public disclosure. Graziella's reputation for persistence did not emerge from dramatic acts of recklessness. Rather, it reflected a professional commitment to understanding events beyond the surface level. She believed that journalism should illuminate the hidden mechanisms behind political decisions and international events. Her interests naturally drew her toward subjects where governments, armed organizations, and intelligence agencies operated in overlapping spheres of influence. Those areas rarely offered simple narratives. Instead, they demanded careful examination of competing claims, conflicting loyalties, and incomplete evidence. Such work required both intellectual curiosity and personal courage. Although later discussions about her disappearance often emphasize the dangers she faced, it is equally important to recognize the professional motivation behind her reporting. She traveled not in search of adventure, but in pursuit of documented facts about issues she believed deserved public scrutiny. If Graziella represented the energy of a younger generation of investigative reporters, Italo Toni brought the perspective of experience accumulated over decades. Born in 1927, Toni had spent years reporting from the Middle East, developing a familiarity with the region that few Italian journalists possessed. By the time he traveled to Lebanon with Graziella, He had already established himself as a veteran correspondent with extensive knowledge of political developments throughout the area. His reporting had exposed him to conflicts, negotiations, and shifting alliances that defined much of the Middle East during the second half of the 20th century. Unlike journalists arriving in Beirut for the first time, Tony understood the complexities of the region through first-hand observation. He had reported on the Lebanese conflict and maintained contacts among numerous political and military factions. Those relationships were valuable because access often determined whether a journalist could move safely through contested areas or arrange interviews with influential figures. Experience also taught correspondents how rapidly circumstances could change. Alliances that existed 1 month might disappear the next. Neighborhoods considered relatively secure could become battlefields overnight. Tony's familiarity with these realities did not eliminate the dangers of reporting in Lebanon, but it likely influenced how he approached them. Years of foreign correspondence had taught him that understanding local dynamics was essential for both accurate reporting and personal survival. His presence alongside Graziella offered more than companionship. It provided institutional memory, regional knowledge, and a network of contacts developed through years of professional engagement. Together, they complemented one another. Graziella pursued emerging investigative leads with determination, while Tony contributed experience navigating one of the world's most politically fragmented regions. Their partnership reflected a practical balance between youthful investigative ambition and seasoned international reporting. To understand why their investigation focused on Lebanon, one must first appreciate the extraordinary circumstances surrounding the country in 1980. 5 years earlier, Lebanon had descended into a civil war that would ultimately continue until 1990. The conflict transformed a nation once known for commerce, culture, and regional diplomacy into a landscape divided among competing political and military forces. Beirut itself became a symbol of that fragmentation. Different districts were controlled by different organizations, each maintaining its own checkpoints, armed personnel, and political authority. The city's geography reflected its political divisions. Movement from one neighborhood to another often required passing through territory governed by rival groups whose relationships ranged from uneasy cooperation to open hostility. West Beirut, where Graziella and Italo stayed during their visit, was largely controlled by Palestinian organizations. Other areas remained under the influence of Christian militias or other armed factions. Syrian military forces maintained a significant presence within the country, while numerous additional organizations pursued their own objectives. Foreign intelligence agencies also operated throughout Lebanon, monitoring events, cultivating sources, and attempting to influence outcomes that carried regional and international consequences. The Lebanese Civil War was never simply an internal conflict. Instead, it became a point where local disputes intersected with broader geopolitical struggles involving neighboring states, international organizations, and global Cold War rivalries. As a result, Beirut became one of the most heavily observed cities in the Middle East. Governments far beyond Lebanon's borders watched developments closely because decisions made there could affect diplomatic relationships, regional stability, and international security. Amid this environment, another phenomenon flourished: international arms trafficking. The instability created by prolonged conflict generated continuous demand for weapons, ammunition, logistical support, and financing. Multiple governments, organizations, and intermediaries participated in networks that moved military equipment across borders. According to the historical information surrounding the case, significant arms trafficking routes connected Italy with parts of the Middle East, including Palestinian organizations as well as countries such as Libya, Syria, and Iraq. The complexity of these networks made them exceptionally difficult to investigate. Transactions frequently involved intermediaries, unofficial agreements, and overlapping political interests. Individuals participating in one aspect of a supply chain might possess only limited knowledge of broader operations. For investigative journalists, uncovering reliable information required extensive interviews, cross-referencing documents, and establishing trust with sources willing to discuss sensitive subjects. Even when evidence emerged, interpreting its significance demanded careful analysis. Arms shipments often existed within broader political contexts involving diplomacy, intelligence activities, and international negotiations. Consequently, reporting on weapons trafficking rarely remained confined to criminal investigations. It inevitably touched upon governmental policies, foreign relations, and national security considerations. Within this complicated landscape existed another subject that would later become central to discussions surrounding the disappearance of Graziella de Palo and Italo Toni. The unofficial understanding commonly referred to as the Lodo Moro. According to later declassified materials, Italy maintained an informal arrangement with the Palestine Liberation Organization intended to reduce the likelihood of terrorist attacks occurring on Italian territory. The existence of this understanding has been discussed extensively by historians and investigators. Although its precise scope, implementation, and practical implications remain matters of historical debate, it is therefore essential to distinguish carefully between what has been documented and what continues to be interpreted differently by scholars. The available evidence indicates that unofficial contacts existed between Italian authorities and representatives of the Palestine Liberation Organization during this period. However, many details remain contested, and no single interpretation has achieved universal acceptance. What matters for understanding the disappearance is not speculation regarding every aspect of the arrangement, but recognition that such political relationships created an environment where sensitive information could carry significant diplomatic consequences. Journalists investigating connections between Italy and Palestinian organizations therefore operated within a field where reporting might intersect with issues of intelligence, national security, and foreign policy. Whether Graziella and Italo uncovered specific information relating to these matters remains unknown. Nevertheless, the political climate helps explain why their investigative interests attracted attention in later examinations of the case. Against this backdrop, the decision to travel to Lebanon appears both understandable and remarkably ambitious. For journalists committed to investigating international politics, Beirut represented an unparalleled opportunity to observe events firsthand. Stories unfolding there involved refugee populations, armed organizations, international negotiations, intelligence operations, and regional power struggles. Reporting from the city offered access to sources unavailable elsewhere. At the same time, the dangers were impossible to ignore. Every experienced correspondent understood that Lebanon in 1980 demanded extraordinary caution. Violence could erupt unexpectedly. Checkpoints controlled by different factions complicated travel. Meetings with confidential sources required careful planning. Foreign journalists often depended upon trusted local contacts capable of navigating political sensitivities and arranging introductions. Graziella and Italo were fully aware of these realities before arriving. Their decision to proceed reflected professional judgment rather than ignorance of the risks. On August 22, 1980, they began their journey by traveling to Damascus in Syria before continuing onward to Beirut. Their trip received assistance from Nimr Hamad, who at the time served as the Palestine Liberation Organization's representative in Italy. Historical records indicate that such assistance facilitated their access to contacts and locations relevant to their reporting. Upon arriving in Beirut, they checked into the Triumph Hotel, located in West Beirut. Choosing accommodation within that district reflected the practical realities of their investigation. As many of the organizations and individuals they intended to interview operated within Palestinian-controlled areas of the city. Their planned reporting focused on refugee camps, international arms routes, relations between Palestinian organizations and Italy, and the possibility that unofficial political understandings existed between Italian authorities and Palestinian representatives. These were subjects requiring direct observation and conversations with knowledgeable sources. The work demanded patience and discretion. Every interview could contribute another fragment to a much larger puzzle involving regional politics and international diplomacy. Later accounts from colleagues and subsequent documentation suggest that Graziella became particularly interested in several interconnected topics during the course of the investigation. These included alleged arms shipments traveling from Italy to the Middle East, the activities of Italian intelligence services operating in Beirut, extremist Palestinian organizations, and alleged secret agreements involving the Italian government. These interests are documented within the historical record. What remains unknown is precisely what information the journalists succeeded in obtaining before they disappeared. No verified archive of their investigative findings has ever emerged to answer that question. Consequently, historians and investigators have consistently emphasized the distinction between their documented investigative objectives and assumptions regarding what they may have discovered. That distinction is fundamental to understanding the case responsibly. The absence of confirmed evidence leaves room for multiple theories. But responsible historical analysis requires acknowledging where documentation ends and speculation begins. Looking back from the perspective of more than 4 decades, it is tempting to interpret every aspect of their journey as an inevitable progression toward tragedy. Yet history rarely unfolds with such clarity in real time. To Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni, Beirut represented the next stage of an important investigation rather than the final chapter of their lives. They arrived as journalists pursuing answers to difficult questions in one of the world's most complicated political environments. Their experience, preparation, and professional commitment shaped every decision they made. None of those qualities, however, could eliminate the unpredictable dangers of a city consumed by war, divided by competing authorities and shadowed by international intelligence operations. As September approached, the investigation continued. Meetings were arranged. Sources were contacted. Information was gathered piece by piece. Then, as the calendar turned to the first days of September 1980, events began moving toward the final verified moments before history gave way to one of Italy's most enduring unsolved mysteries. By the beginning of September 1980, Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni had already spent several days navigating Beirut's fractured political landscape. Their journey had followed a deliberate plan rather than an improvised assignment. They had traveled first to Damascus on August 22nd before continuing into Lebanon, entering a country that had been torn apart by 5 years of civil war. Every movement through Beirut required awareness of invisible political boundaries that divided neighborhoods controlled by different armed organizations. Every meeting depended on trust, local knowledge, and careful coordination. For foreign journalists attempting to investigate sensitive political subjects, the city demanded constant caution. It was an environment where information possessed immense value, but where asking questions could attract attention from individuals determined to protect their own interests. Despite those realities, the available historical record suggests that Graziella and Italo continued their work methodically. They had not arrived to produce superficial coverage of daily fighting. Their objective was to investigate issues that connected Lebanon's conflict to broader political relationships extending into Italy itself. Those objectives shaped every meeting they attempted to arrange and every source they hoped to. Interviewed during the final days before their disappearance, the two journalists had established themselves at the Triumph Hotel in West Beirut, an area controlled by Palestinian organizations during the Lebanese Civil War. Their choice of accommodation reflected the practical needs of their investigation rather than personal preference. Many of the individuals they hoped to contact operated within West Beirut, making the location strategically important. The hotel served as a temporary base from which they organized interviews, traveled across the city when possible, and continued gathering information concerning refugee camps, international arms routes, relations between Palestinian organizations and Italy, and the possibility that unofficial political understandings existed between Italian authorities and representatives of the Palestine Liberation Organization. These were subjects requiring direct conversations rather than distant observation. Documentary evidence alone could not explain how political agreements functioned in practice or how weapons allegedly moved across international networks. Investigative journalism depended upon first-hand accounts, confidential sources, and careful comparison of competing narratives. Every conversation added another fragment to a larger picture that remained incomplete. Later accounts from colleagues and subsequent investigations indicate that Graziella DiPaolo developed a particular interest in several interconnected topics while working in Beirut. Historical records identify these interests as alleged arms shipments traveling from Italy toward the Middle East. The activities of Italian intelligence personnel operating within Lebanon, extremist Palestinian organizations, and alleged secret agreements involving the Italian government. These investigative interests are documented. However, an important distinction must be maintained throughout the story. While the subjects she pursued are known, the precise information she and Italo succeeded in obtaining remains unknown. No complete archive of their research has ever been recovered to reveal the extent of their findings. Consequently, historians continue to distinguish between verified investigative objectives and assumptions regarding what the journalists may have discovered before they disappeared. That uncertainty would later become one of the defining features of the entire case, allowing numerous theories to emerge while preventing any of them from being conclusively verified. The historical record does not preserve every meeting the journalists attended during their stay in Beirut. Like many investigative reporters working with confidential sources, they necessarily protected the identities of people willing to provide information. Such discretion was essential in a conflict zone where revealing a source's identity could endanger lives. What is documented is that their reporting focused increasingly on politically sensitive subjects involving multiple governments, armed organizations, and intelligence interests. In retrospect, observers have often noted that these topics place the journalists within one of the most complicated political environments imaginable. Yet it is equally important to avoid assuming that danger automatically implied imminent violence. Foreign correspondents had reported from Beirut throughout the Civil War. Despite extraordinary risks, they relied upon careful planning, trusted intermediaries, and professional judgment developed through experience. Graziella and Italo approached their work with precisely that combination of preparation and caution. Nothing in the available evidence suggests that they acted recklessly or ignored obvious risks. Rather, they appear to be conducting a serious investigative assignment within the constraints imposed by an active war zone. As the final days of August came to an end, their investigation continued. Meetings were scheduled, information was reviewed, and preparations were made for additional interviews. Somewhere within this ordinary rhythm of investigative work lay the final transition from documented history into enduring mystery. That transition began on September 1st, 1980. with a visit whose significance would only become clear after the journalists had vanished. On September 1st, Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni went to the Italian embassy in Beirut. Visits to diplomatic missions were not unusual for journalists working abroad, particularly in unstable regions where embassies often provided logistical assistance, communication facilities, or simply a point of contact should emergencies arise. During that visit, according to later accounts that became part of the historical record, the two journalists delivered a brief but memorable message to embassy personnel. They reportedly said, "If we don't come back within 3 days, come looking for us." The sentence has since become one of the most frequently quoted aspects of the entire case. Its significance lies not only in its wording, but in what it reveals about the journalists. Awareness of their circumstances. They evidently recognized that the meeting they intended to attend carried enough uncertainty to justify informing Italian officials of their absence should they fail to return. Exactly why they expressed this concern remains unknown. The available evidence does not establish whether they had received specific warnings, encountered unusual circumstances during their investigation, or were merely following prudent professional practice before meeting confidential sources in a conflict zone. Responsible historical analysis cannot answer that question definitively because the necessary evidence does not exist. Investigators later viewed the statement as an indication that Graziella and Italo anticipated some level of risk. But anticipation of risk was not uncommon among experienced correspondents working in Beirut during the Civil War. Journalists often informed colleagues, editors, or diplomatic officials about planned movements precisely because the environment was unpredictable. Therefore, while the embassy warning undoubtedly became haunting in retrospect, it should not automatically be interpreted as proof that the journalists knew they were walking into a trap. The historical record simply cannot support such a conclusion. Nevertheless, the emotional weight of that statement is impossible to ignore. It has endured because history transformed an ordinary precaution into the final documented communication before an unexplained disappearance. Countless investigations over the following decades would return to those words, searching for hidden meaning within a sentence that may originally have been intended only as a sensible safeguard. The warning illustrates one of the central frustrations surrounding this case. Events that seem ordinary before a disappearance often become intensely significant afterward, even though their true meaning can never be fully recovered. The following morning, September 2nd, 1980, began like any other day of investigative reporting. According to the available historical evidence, Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni departed from the Triumph Hotel in West Beirut. Witnesses reported seeing them leave the hotel and get into a Jeep. They indicated that they were traveling south to meet a source. That destination represented the final known purpose of their journey. Beyond this point, certainty disappears. No verified evidence confirms whether they ever reached the meeting they intended to attend. No reliable witness has established their movements after they entered the vehicle. No authenticated records document where they traveled during the remainder of the day. The investigation has never identified a confirmed crime scene, nor has it established a precise location where the disappearance occurred. Instead, the available chronology simply ends with the journalists leaving the hotel. This abrupt termination of reliable information profoundly complicated every subsequent investigation. Most criminal investigations begin with at least one fixed point, a location, a body, physical evidence, surveillance footage, eyewitness testimony, or some combination of these elements. In the disappearance of Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni, investigators possessed almost none of these advantages. The final confirmed sighting occurred before any crime had been established. From that moment onward, every attempt to reconstruct events encountered the same obstacle: There was almost nothing concrete to examine. The absence of communication quickly became one of the earliest warning signs that something had gone terribly wrong. No verified telephone calls were received from either journalist after September 2nd. No letters arrived to reassure colleagues or family members that their assignment had merely been delayed. No photographs documented continued travel elsewhere in Lebanon or neighboring countries. Financial records failed to reveal any subsequent activity that might indicate voluntary movement or survival. Investigators likewise found no confirmed witnesses capable of placing either Graziella or Italo alive after they departed the Triumph Hotel. In historical investigations, silence can sometimes become evidence in its own right. Here, the complete disappearance of every ordinary sign of life suggested that whatever happened occurred suddenly enough to prevent any further communication. For family members, colleagues, and editors awaiting news from Beirut, concern gradually transformed into alarm. Journalists working in conflict zones occasionally experience delays caused by transportation difficulties, disrupted communications, or changing military conditions. Yet complete silence extending beyond expected reporting schedules inevitably raised fears. The embassy warning delivered the previous day now acquired alarming significance. 3 days passed. The journalists did not return. The instruction they had left behind could no longer be dismissed as routine caution. It became the starting point for an international search that would continue, in one form or another, for decades. The disappearance itself left investigators confronting an almost impossible challenge. Without confirmed knowledge of where the journalists had gone after leaving the hotel, authorities struggled even to determine which organizations or territories should become the focus of initial inquiries. Southern Lebanon during 1980 contained numerous armed groups operating within overlapping areas of influence. Control over particular regions could shift rapidly. Witnesses were difficult to locate. Memories became uncertain. The ongoing civil war further complicated every effort to gather reliable evidence. Records were incomplete. Access to certain locations depended upon negotiations with armed factions rather than ordinary law. Enforcement procedures. Time, always a critical factor in missing person investigations, worked relentlessly against those seeking answers. As days became weeks without any confirmed trace of the two journalists, speculation naturally began to emerge. Had they been kidnapped? Had they reached their intended meeting? Had they encountered an unexpected checkpoint? Were they victims of political violence, mistaken identity, or something directly connected to their investigation? These questions would eventually shape decades of inquiry. Yet at the moment of their disappearance, investigators possessed insufficient evidence to answer any of them. Every possibility remained open because almost every relevant fact remained unknown. This uncertainty distinguishes the disappearance of Graziella de Palo and Italo Toni from many other criminal investigations. Rather than beginning with an identifiable event whose circumstances gradually became clearer through accumulating evidence, this case began with a void. The transition from documented reality to mystery occurred within the simple act of leaving a hotel and entering a vehicle. Everything before that morning can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence. Everything afterward remains obscured by missing evidence, incomplete records, and unanswered questions. The silence that followed September 2nd, 1980, would become more than the absence of two journalists. It would become a challenge to investigators, governments, historians, and families seeking certainty where almost none existed. Every year that passed without answers deepened the mystery. While the political complexity surrounding their reporting encouraged new theories about what might have happened. Yet before any theory could be examined, authorities first faced a far more immediate problem: 2 Italian citizens had vanished inside a country devastated by civil war, and almost no reliable evidence pointed toward where the search should begin. That difficult search, marked by delays, missing documentation, state secrecy, and decades of unanswered questions, would become the next chapter in one of the most enduring unsolved disappearances in modern Italian history. The disappearance of Graziella De Palo and Italo Toni became an investigation unlike most. Missing person cases from the very beginning. Normally, investigators start with something tangible, a crime scene, physical evidence, eyewitness testimony, or at least a confirmed location where events began to unfold. In Beirut, during September 1980, none of those advantages existed. Investigators knew where the 2 journalists had been staying. They knew that on the morning of September 2nd, they had left the Triumph Hotel, entered a Jeep, and stated that they were traveling south to meet a source. Beyond that point, the trail simply vanished. There were no confirmed sightings after their departure, no documented communications, no financial activity, and no physical evidence indicating where they had gone or what had happened. Every attempt to reconstruct the following hours encountered the same obstacle. The disappearance itself had erased nearly every trace that investigators normally depend upon. What remained was not merely an unsolved case, but a historical void surrounded by one of the most politically complicated environments in the world. When the journalists failed to return within the time frame they had mentioned at the Italian embassy, concern quickly spread among those who knew about their assignment. Their earlier warning, asking embassy personnel to look for them if they had not returned within 3 days, suddenly became much more than a precaution. It now served as confirmation that the prolonged silence should not be dismissed as an ordinary delay caused by the chaos of wartime Beirut. Family members in Italy were informed that communication had ceased. Colleagues who understood the risks of conflict reporting recognized that the absence of any contact was deeply unusual. While war zones often disrupted travel and communication, experienced correspondents typically found ways to report their safety whenever circumstances allowed. Days passed without any verified message from either Graziella De Palo or Italo Toni. The concern that initially accompanied their overdue return gradually transformed into the realization that they had become missing under circumstances no one could explain. The first challenge confronting Italian authorities was geographical as much as investigative. Lebanon in 1980 was not a country where ordinary law enforcement procedures could easily be applied. The Lebanese Civil War had divided territory among numerous armed organizations whose authority varied from district to district. Areas under the influence of Palestinian organizations differed from those controlled by Christian militias or affected by the presence of Syrian military forces. Foreign intelligence services also maintained active operations throughout the region. As a result, locating 2 missing foreign journalists required navigating an environment where political boundaries frequently mattered more than official administrative structures. Investigators could not simply search freely across the country. Access to certain locations depended upon negotiations, cooperation, or permission from organizations whose priorities often had little to do with assisting a missing person investigation. Every delay reduced the likelihood of recovering reliable evidence. In any investigation, time is critical. In a country fragmented by civil war, lost time could rarely be recovered. Historical accounts consistently describe the initial response from the Italian side as slow. Families seeking answers would later criticize the pace of official action, arguing that more immediate and determined efforts might have produced additional information before memories faded and evidence disappeared. Whether earlier intervention would have changed the outcome remains impossible to determine. The reality investigators faced was extraordinarily difficult regardless of timing. Witnesses were scattered across a city devastated by conflict. Reliable records were limited. Movement between different sectors of Beirut often depended upon rapidly changing military circumstances. Even establishing the identities of everyone the journalists had met during their final days proved challenging because investigative reporting naturally relies upon confidential sources. Protecting those sources had been an essential part of Graziella and Italo's work while they were alive. Ironically, that same professional discretion complicated efforts to retrace their movements after they disappeared. Another obstacle emerged from the simple absence of physical evidence. No confirmed crime scene was ever identified. Investigators could not examine forensic evidence because no location connected directly to the disappearance had been established. No vehicle associated with the journalists was recovered in a manner that explained their fate. No verified witness came forward with a detailed account describing what happened after the pair left the Triumph Hotel. There were no confirmed letters or messages indicating voluntary disappearance. Financial records produced no evidence that either journalist continued traveling elsewhere under their own control. Instead, every ordinary indicator of daily life stopped simultaneously. Such complete silence naturally encouraged speculation. Yet speculation alone could not satisfy the evidentiary standards required for criminal investigation. Authorities needed facts capable of supporting legal conclusions. Those facts remained painfully scarce. As weeks turned into months, investigators attempted to gather information from numerous possible sources operating within Lebanon. However, the political complexity of the civil war meant that information itself often carried uncertain reliability. Rumors spread quickly in conflict zones. Different organizations possessed their own political interests, and accounts provided by one faction could contradict those offered by another. Distinguishing verified intelligence from misinformation became extraordinarily difficult. Moreover, even truthful witnesses might possess only fragments of the larger picture. Someone observing a vehicle at one checkpoint could not necessarily know what occurred farther down the road. Someone hearing secondhand reports could unintentionally pass along inaccurate information without intending to mislead investigators. Every lead required careful verification, yet opportunities for verification remained limited by the conditions of war. Over time, another source of frustration emerged for both investigators and the families of the missing journalists. Many official documents relating to the case remained inaccessible. In 1984, 4 years after the disappearance, the Italian government imposed state secret protections over numerous documents connected to the affair. This decision would become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. State secrecy is a legal mechanism intended to protect information considered sensitive to national security or the interests of the state. In practice, however, its application meant that investigators, journalists, historians, and even family members faced significant barriers when attempting to understand what Italian authorities knew about the disappearance or about the broader political circumstances surrounding it. The decision immediately generated difficult questions. Why were these materials considered so sensitive? Did they contain evidence explaining what had happened to Graziella and Italo? Or did they primarily concern broader diplomatic relationships unrelated to the journalists? Ultimate fate? The available historical record cannot fully answer those questions because the secrecy itself limited access to information for many years. The existence of state secret protections profoundly shaped public perception of the case. For many observers, secrecy encouraged suspicion that authorities possessed crucial information they were unwilling to disclose. Others argued that the protected materials likely concerned broader intelligence matters rather than direct evidence about the disappearance itself. Both perspectives have appeared repeatedly throughout decades of public discussion. What remains established fact is that the application of state secrecy complicated investigative efforts and delayed public understanding of many aspects of the historical context. Rather than reducing speculation, the absence of accessible documentation often intensified it. When official records remain unavailable, unanswered questions naturally invite competing interpretations. Despite these limitations, investigators gradually developed several principal hypotheses intended to explain the disappearance. It is essential, however, to distinguish clearly between investigative theories and established facts. None of the principal hypotheses has ever been conclusively proven in court, and no definitive evidence has resolved which, if any, accurately describes what happened after September 2, 1980. The first major hypothesis proposes that Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni were kidnapped and subsequently killed by members of a Palestinian faction operating within Lebanon. Over the years, some investigators considered this the explanation most consistent with available information. According to certain investigative conclusions developed during earlier inquiries, the journalists may have been detained because individuals believed they had acquired sensitive information. They may have been questioned and then killed shortly afterward. This hypothesis attempts to explain why no further communications ever emerged and why no confirmed evidence of prolonged captivity has ever surfaced. Nevertheless, despite its prominence, the theory remains unproven. No court has established responsibility. No physical evidence has conclusively identified either the perpetrators or the precise circumstances of the disappearance. Consequently, although the hypothesis has received serious consideration, it remains an investigative possibility rather than an established historical fact. The second major hypothesis centers on the journalist's documented investigative interests concerning international arms trafficking. Historical records confirm that Graziella DiPaolo was examining alleged arms shipments connecting Italy and the Middle East, as well as broader political relationships surrounding those activities. Some investigative journalists and researchers have suggested that Graziella and Italo may have uncovered information concerning sensitive arms routes involving multiple actors across the region. If such information existed, those responsible for protecting the network might have possessed a motive to silence the reporters permanently. Again, however, this theory must be approached with caution. While the journalists' interest in arms trafficking is documented, no definitive evidence establishes exactly what information they obtained before disappearing. The available evidence, therefore, cannot confirm that their investigation directly caused their disappearance. The possibility remains significant because of the subjects they were pursuing, but responsible historical analysis requires acknowledging the absence of conclusive proof. The third principal hypothesis concerns the unofficial political understanding commonly referred to as the Lodo Moro. According to later declassified materials, Italy maintained informal contacts and understandings with the Palestine Liberation Organization intended to reduce terrorist attacks on Italian territory. Some researchers have argued that Graziella and Italo may have approached information whose disclosure could have embarrassed governments or complicated sensitive diplomatic relationships. From this perspective, the disappearance may have become intertwined with broader political considerations extending far beyond Lebanon itself. Yet once again, historians emphasize the distinction between possibility and proof. No judicial authority has concluded that the disappearance resulted from knowledge of the Lodo Moro. No documentary evidence directly links the journalist's final movements to such political arrangements. The theory persists because it aligns with the sensitive nature of their reporting and the later application of state secrecy. But it remains precisely that, a theory rather than a legally established conclusion. One of the most remarkable aspects of the investigation is that decades passed before significant. Quantities of official documentation became available for public examination. Beginning in 2009, followed by additional releases in 2014 and 2022. Various documents were declassified or otherwise made accessible. These releases did not solve the disappearance, but they did illuminate aspects of the historical background surrounding the case. The materials demonstrated that Italian intelligence services had monitored elements connected to the affair and that shortcomings existed in the way the disappearance had initially been handled. They also provided additional context regarding Italy's political relationships with Palestinian organizations during the period. For historians, these documents represented important progress because they replaced speculation with verifiable evidence concerning parts of the broader political environment. At the same time, the declassified materials also highlighted the limits of documentary evidence. They clarified aspects of governmental awareness, diplomatic relations, and investigative shortcomings. Yet they did not reveal what ultimately happened to Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni after they entered the Jeep on September 2, 1980. The central mystery remained intact. There was still no confirmed location where they died, no identified perpetrators, and no recovered remains capable of providing forensic answers. Instead of resolving the disappearance, the newly available documents reinforced an uncomfortable historical reality. Governments may preserve records about political circumstances, but those records cannot necessarily reconstruct events that no one successfully documented when they occurred. For the families of Graziella and Italo, every new release of official material represented both hope and disappointment. Hope that another document might finally contain the answer they had sought for decades, and disappointment when each disclosure revealed only another piece of context rather than the decisive evidence capable of explaining their loved one's fate. Historians likewise found themselves confronting a paradox. The more documentation became available concerning the political environment of 1980, the more clearly they understood the extraordinary complexity surrounding the journalists' investigation. Yet understanding the environment did not necessarily illuminate the disappearance itself. By the end of the 20th century and into the 21st, the investigation had evolved beyond an ordinary criminal inquiry. It became a broader examination of journalism, intelligence, diplomacy, state secrecy, and the limitations of historical evidence. The disappearance of Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni remained unsolved, not because investigators lacked theories, but because every theory eventually encountered the same obstacle: insufficient proof. Facts established the beginning of the story with remarkable clarity. Two journalists traveled to Lebanon to investigate politically sensitive subjects. They warned embassy personnel to look for them if they failed to return. They left their hotel on September 2nd to meet a source. After that, certainty ended. Everything that followed has been shaped by painstaking investigation, partial documentation, competing hypotheses, and decades of unanswered questions that continue to define one of Italy's most enduring modern mysteries. Unlike many true crime stories, the disappearance of Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni never reached the stage that most criminal investigations ultimately seek. There was no dramatic arrest announced before television cameras. There was no courtroom filled with witnesses recounting the final hours of the victims' lives. There were no prosecutors presenting forensic evidence to a jury, no defense attorneys challenging eyewitness testimony, and no judge delivering a verdict after weeks of legal proceedings. Instead, the legal history of this case is defined largely by what never happened. The absence of definitive evidence prevented investigators from transforming decades of suspicion into criminal charges. As years passed, the case evolved into an unusual legal paradox. The historical importance of the disappearance continued to grow. Public interest never completely disappeared. Official investigations persisted in various forms. Yet the judicial system remained unable to identify anyone who could legally be held responsible. The story entered Italian legal history not because of a famous trial, but because the trial everyone expected could never begin. The most immediate obstacle facing prosecutors was remarkably straightforward. Before criminal responsibility can be established, investigators must first determine what crime occurred and who committed it. In the disappearance of Graziella De Palo and Italo Toni, both questions remained unanswered. Although investigators generally believed that the journalists had not disappeared voluntarily, proving that conclusion according to legal standards required evidence stronger than reasonable suspicion. The absence of confirmed bodies made the task considerably more difficult. In many homicide investigations, forensic examination provides crucial information concerning cause of death, approximate time of death, injuries sustained, and sometimes even the identity of perpetrators through physical traces left behind. None of those investigative opportunities existed here. Without recovered remains, prosecutors could not rely upon the forensic evidence that often becomes central during criminal proceedings. Every legal decision, therefore, depended almost entirely upon circumstantial evidence, historical documentation, witness accounts of varying reliability, and intelligence information that was often incomplete or classified. The circumstances surrounding the disappearance also complicated the identification of possible suspects. The journalists vanished inside a country experiencing an active civil war, where numerous armed organizations, military forces, political groups, and foreign intelligence services operated simultaneously. Even if investigators developed credible theories regarding responsibility, transforming those theories into prosecutable cases required evidence directly connecting identifiable individuals to specific criminal acts. Such evidence never emerged. Historical investigations produced hypotheses regarding possible perpetrators, particularly the theory that members of the Palestinian faction may have detained and subsequently killed the journalists after suspecting them of obtaining sensitive information. However, investigative theories do not automatically satisfy judicial standards. Courts require evidence capable of establishing guilt beyond the applicable legal threshold. In this case, no such evidence became available. Consequently, no individual was formally convicted in connection with the disappearance. For the families of Graziella De Palo and Italo Toni, this legal reality carried profound emotional consequences. The absence of criminal convictions meant more than a lack of punishment. It also meant that no official judicial proceeding ever reconstructed the final hours of their loved ones' lives with certainty. Families of crime victims often endure painful trials, but those proceedings at least provide opportunities to hear evidence presented openly before court. Witnesses testify, documents become public, investigators explain how conclusions were reached. Even when verdicts remain controversial, the judicial process creates an official narrative supported by available evidence. In the case of Graziella and Italo, no comparable moment ever occurred. Instead, relatives spent decades confronting uncertainty rather than definitive judicial findings. Every new investigative development raised hope that answers might finally emerge, only for those hopes to confront the same fundamental obstacle. The evidence remained insufficient to support prosecution. The legal difficulties were further compounded by the decision of the Italian government in 1984 to apply state secret protections to numerous documents connected with the affair, although this decision did not formally terminate the investigation. It undeniably affected its development. Prosecutors, historians, journalists and family members encountered limitations regarding access to materials considered relevant to understanding the broader political context surrounding the disappearance. State secrecy exists within many legal systems as a mechanism intended to protect information affecting national security or sensitive governmental interests. Yet its application inevitably creates tension between the state's interest in confidentiality and the public's interest in transparency. In this case, that tension became one of the defining legal characteristics of the investigation. Critics argued that prolonged secrecy delayed efforts to understand what had happened. Others maintained that the protected materials primarily concerned broader intelligence and diplomatic matters rather than direct evidence identifying those responsible for the disappearance. Whatever the precise content of the classified documents, the practical effect was undeniable. The legal search for truth unfolded within an environment where not every relevant record could immediately be examined by those seeking answers. As decades passed, the case increasingly occupied an unusual position between criminal investigation and historical inquiry. Active investigative efforts continued intermittently, while historians examined newly available documentation to reconstruct the political circumstances of 1980. This gradual shift reflected the changing nature of evidence itself. Fresh forensic discoveries never appeared. Instead, progress depended largely upon archival research, declassified governmental records, and renewed analysis of existing materials. Beginning in 2009 and continuing with additional releases in 2014 and 2022, various documents became available that shed further light on the broader context of the disappearance. These releases demonstrated that Italian intelligence services had followed aspects of the affair, and that shortcomings existed in the original investigative response. They also provided additional information regarding political relations between Italy and Palestinian organizations during the relevant period. For legal observers, however, these developments highlighted an important distinction. Historical understanding had improved, but prosecutorial evidence remained largely unchanged. Learning more about the environment surrounding the disappearance did not automatically identify the individuals responsible. The continuing absence of definitive legal resolution prompted renewed efforts years later. In 2019, the Rome Public Prosecutor's Office reopened the investigation into the disappearance of Graziella De Palo and Italo Toni. This decision reflected both the emergence of additional documentation and the enduring determination to pursue unanswered questions despite the passage of nearly 4 decades. Reopening an investigation after such a long interval is always challenging. Witnesses may no longer be available. Memories inevitably fade. Physical evidence, if it ever existed, may have been lost forever. Political circumstances change, governments change, and individuals connected to historical events may have died before investigators can question them. Nevertheless, reopening the case demonstrated that Italian judicial authorities had not abandoned the search for answers. The passage of time did not diminish the significance of the disappearance, nor did it erase the state's responsibility to examine any credible new information that became available. The reopening also underscored another important legal principle. An unsolved case does not become closed merely because many years have passed without resolution. Investigators remain obligated to evaluate newly discovered evidence whenever it possesses potential relevance. In the disappearance of Graziella and Italo, prosecutors examined fresh leads alongside recently available historical documents, seeking connections that earlier investigations may have overlooked. Yet despite these renewed efforts, no breakthrough sufficient to transform the case into a criminal prosecution emerged. The investigation remained active in the sense that authorities continued reviewing information, but it still lacked the decisive evidence required to identify perpetrators or present charges before court. Consequently, the official legal outcome remains remarkably concise despite the extraordinary complexity of the surrounding history. Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni continue to be officially regarded as missing. Their bodies have never been recovered. No individual has been convicted of kidnapping, murdering, or otherwise causing their disappearance. No completed homicide trial has established a definitive sequence of events explaining what occurred after they left the Triumph Hotel on the morning of September 2nd, 1980. The principal investigative hypotheses remain exactly that, hypotheses. Some possess stronger support within investigative records than others, but none has been judicially confirmed through criminal proceedings. From a legal perspective, the disappearance therefore remains unresolved. This absence of judicial closure has influenced how the case is remembered within Italy. Rather than being associated with a landmark criminal verdict, it is remembered as one of the country's enduring unresolved mysteries, where law, politics, diplomacy, intelligence activity, and investigative journalism intersect without producing definitive legal conclusions. Every subsequent discussion of the case must therefore distinguish carefully between documented facts, investigative assessments, historical interpretations, and legal findings. The verified facts establish that 2 journalists disappeared while pursuing politically sensitive reporting in Lebanon. Investigative authorities developed several plausible explanations. Historical documentation has gradually expanded understanding of the political environment surrounding their work. Yet none of these developments has produced the level of proof necessary for criminal accountability. For the families who spent decades waiting for certainty, this legal outcome offers little comfort. Courts exist to establish responsibility when evidence permits. In this case, the evidence never reached that threshold. Every document released, every renewed inquiry, and every historical reassessment has added context without delivering finality. The investigation has illuminated many aspects of the world in which Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni disappeared, but it has not answered the question that mattered most to those who loved them. What happened after they entered that Jeep on the morning of September 2nd, 1980? Legally, the case remains suspended between knowledge and uncertainty. Supported by decades of investigation, yet still lacking the proof required to complete the judicial process. It stands as a reminder that not every disappearance, no matter how significant or thoroughly examined, ultimately reaches a courtroom where history can be translated into legal certainty. More than 4 decades have passed since Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni walked out of the Triumph Hotel in West Beirut on the morning of September 2nd, 1980. Entire generations have grown up without ever witnessing the political climate that surrounded their disappearance. The Lebanese Civil War eventually came to an end. Governments changed in both Italy and Lebanon. International alliances shifted, intelligence agencies evolved, and many of the organizations that dominated headlines during the Cold War either transformed or disappeared altogether. Yet despite the passage of time, one simple reality has remained unchanged. No one can say with certainty what happened to the 2 Italian journalists after they entered Jeep and set out to meet a source. Their disappearance has resisted decades of investigation, political debate, historical research, and renewed judicial attention. Time has answered many historical questions surrounding the broader political environment of 1980, but it has not answered the one question their families have carried for more than 40 years. For those families, the disappearance never became an event confined to history books. It remained a deeply personal absence that could never be fully resolved. Unlike families who are eventually able to bury loved ones, mourn with certainty, and begin rebuilding their lives around known facts, The relatives of Graziella de Palo and Italo Toni were left confronting uncertainty itself. Every anniversary carried the possibility that some new document, some forgotten witness, or some overlooked archive might finally reveal the truth. Every announcement concerning newly declassified records inevitably revived hope that this time the missing pieces might finally emerge. Yet each successive development produced the same difficult outcome. More context became available. More political background could be understood. More information surfaced regarding the atmosphere in which the journalists had worked. But the central mystery remained untouched. There were still no recovered bodies, no confirmed perpetrators, and no definitive reconstruction of their final hours. The uncertainty became a permanent part of the family's lives. One of the cruelest aspects of unresolved disappearances is that they deny people the certainty required to process grief. Human beings naturally search for explanations. Even painful truths can eventually be confronted when supported by evidence. Uncertainty, however, offers no such stability. It allows hope and despair to coexist indefinitely. The disappearance of Graziella and Italo illustrates this reality with painful clarity. Every investigative hypothesis presents a possible explanation, yet none can be accepted as definitive. Every newly released document expands historical understanding while leaving the ultimate question unanswered. The result is not closure, but an enduring suspension between knowledge and mystery. For the journalistic community, the disappearance carries a significance extending beyond the fate of two individual reporters. Graziella de Palo and Italo Toni were engaged in investigative journalism at a time when obtaining reliable information required extraordinary personal commitment. Their work focused on international arms trafficking, intelligence activities, political relationships between Italy and Palestinian organizations, and developments within a region experiencing violent conflict. These were subjects characterized by secrecy, competing interests, and rapidly changing political realities. Reporting on such issues demanded more than simply attending official press conferences or repeating government statements. It required entering environments where information itself possessed immense political value. The historical record demonstrates that Graziella, despite being only 24 years old, had already established a reputation for seeking primary sources rather than relying solely upon official explanations. Italo Toni contributed years of regional experience and extensive contacts developed through reporting across the Middle East. Together, they represented the essential principles of investigative journalism: careful observation, independent inquiry, and a determination to understand complex events beyond superficial narratives. Their disappearance, therefore, became more than an individual tragedy. It became a reminder of the risks sometimes faced by journalists attempting to investigate subjects involving war, intelligence, diplomacy, and international political relationships. At the same time, the case also demonstrates the limits of journalism itself. Investigative reporting seeks to uncover hidden truths, but it does not guarantee that every question will ultimately receive an answer. In the disappearance of Graziella and Italo, those who dedicated their careers to revealing concealed information became the subjects of one of Italy's greatest unsolved mysteries. The investigators who later attempted to reconstruct their final movements encountered many of the same barriers that the journalists themselves had faced while pursuing their own investigation. Incomplete information, fragmented documentation, conflicting accounts, and political complexity. The search for truth became a mirror reflecting the very conditions that had originally drawn the journalists to Beirut. Within Italy, the disappearance gradually assumed a place among what are commonly described as the country's misteri d'Italia, the enduring national mysteries that continue to provoke debate long after the original events occurred. These cases occupy a unique position in public memory because they exist at the intersection of documented history and unresolved uncertainty. They involve events that undeniably happened, yet remain incompletely understood despite years of official investigation. Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni's disappearance fits this description precisely. The facts surrounding their journey to Lebanon are well documented. Their professional objectives are known. Their final verified movements have been reconstructed with reasonable confidence. The broader political environment of 1980 has become much clearer through historical research and the gradual release of official documents. Nevertheless, the decisive moment, the transition from investigative assignment to disappearance, remains hidden behind an absence of evidence that has never been overcome. The gradual declassification of official documents beginning in 2009 and continuing through later. Releases in 2014 and 2022 demonstrated that history is rarely static. Governments sometimes release information that was once considered too sensitive for public examination. Historians reassess old conclusions in light of newly available evidence. Judicial authorities revisit investigations when additional material emerges. These developments remind us that historical understanding can evolve even decades after an event occurs. In the case of Graziella and Italo, the released documents expanded knowledge about Italy's relations with Palestinian organizations, confirmed that intelligence services had monitored aspects of the affair, and revealed shortcomings in the original investigative response. Such revelations contributed meaningfully to historical scholarship. Yet they also highlighted an important limitation. Political context can be reconstructed more easily than individual fate. Governments may preserve diplomatic records, intelligence assessments, and administrative decisions. But those records cannot necessarily explain what happened during unrecorded moments inside a war zone. The reopening of the investigation by the Rome Public Prosecutor's Office in 2019 further demonstrated that the search for answers had not been abandoned. Even after nearly 40 years, authorities remained willing to examine new documents and reconsider existing evidence. That decision reflected an enduring commitment to pursue unresolved questions whenever credible opportunities arise. It also acknowledged the continuing importance of the case within Italian legal and historical consciousness. Nevertheless, reopening an investigation does not guarantee resolution. The passage of time inevitably erodes opportunities for discovering new physical evidence or interviewing surviving witnesses with precise memories. Every year that passes makes certainty more difficult to achieve. Perhaps the most striking feature of this case is the contrast between what is known and what remains unknown. Historians today understand the geopolitical environment surrounding the journalist's assignment far better than investigators could in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance. They understand that Lebanon in 1980 was fragmented by civil war, that numerous armed organizations operated simultaneously, that international arms trafficking networks connected multiple countries, and that sensitive political relationships existed between Italy and the Palestine Liberation Organization. They understand the professional interests that brought Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni to Beirut. They know where the journalists stayed, what subjects they intended to investigate, and the warning they delivered at the Italian embassy before disappearing. Yet despite all this accumulated knowledge, the most basic question still has no verified answer. What happened after they left the Triumph Hotel on September 2nd, 1980? It is tempting in unresolved cases to search for certainty within theories. Human nature prefers complete narratives to unanswered questions. Yet responsible historical inquiry requires restraint. The disappearance of Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Tony has generated several significant hypotheses. Over the decades, some investigators considered it likely that they were abducted and killed by members of a Palestinian faction. Others emphasized the possibility that their investigation into international arms trafficking exposed information dangerous enough to provide a motive for silencing them. Still others examined whether the unofficial political understanding known as the Lodo Moro formed part of the broader context surrounding the case. Each theory seeks to explain the available evidence. None has been conclusively proven. The distinction between possibility and certainty remains fundamental. Respect for both historical truth and the memory of the missing journalists requires acknowledging that unresolved questions cannot be transformed into established facts simply because they appear plausible. This distinction also reflects one of the central ethical responsibilities of journalism itself. Graziella and Italo devoted their professional lives to separating documented reality from unsupported claims. It would therefore be inconsistent to honor their work by presenting speculation as certainty. Their legacy is better served by preserving the integrity of the available evidence, even when that evidence leaves difficult questions unanswered. In many respects, the greatest tribute to investigative journalists lies not in constructing dramatic conclusions, but in maintaining an unwavering commitment to factual accuracy despite the frustration of incomplete information. The image that continues to define this case is not one of violence or courtroom drama. It is the quiet moment inside the Italian embassy on September 1st, 1980, when two experienced journalists reportedly offered a simple instruction before departing for another day of reporting. If we don't come back within 3 days, come looking for us. Those words were spoken as a practical precaution in a city shaped by conflict and uncertainty. No one present could have imagined that the search would continue not for 3 days, but for decades. Their disappearance remains one of the most enduring mysteries in the history of Italian journalism because it stands at the crossroads of several worlds: investigative reporting, international diplomacy, intelligence activity, Middle Eastern conflict, arms trafficking, and state secrecy. Each of these elements helps explain the environment in which Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Tony worked. None fully explains why they vanished. Today, their names continue to be remembered not because their story reached a satisfying conclusion, but because it did not. They remind us that some chapters of history remain unfinished despite determined efforts to complete them. They remind us that journalism often depends upon individuals willing to ask difficult questions in dangerous places. They remind us that governments may eventually release documents. Investigators may reopen old files, and historians may reconstruct forgotten contexts. Yet some mysteries continue to resist definitive explanation. More than 40 years after two journalists climbed into a jeep and disappeared into the uncertainty of wartime Lebanon, the silence that followed still speaks louder than any theory. It speaks of families who never received final answers, investigators who pursued evidence that was never sufficient, historians who carefully separated fact from speculation, and journalists whose final assignment became a mystery that outlived an era. Until verifiable evidence emerges to reveal what happened after that final confirmed journey, the disappearance of Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Tony will remain exactly what history has long recognized it to be: one of Italy's most profound, unresolved mysteries, where the search for truth continues even after the trail itself has disappeared. Some mysteries become smaller as time passes. Witnesses come forward, forgotten documents surface. Investigators connect pieces that once appeared unrelated, and eventually uncertainty gives way to evidence. The disappearance of Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni followed a different path. With every passing decade, historians, journalists, prosecutors, and family members learned more about the world in which the two reporters had worked. Yet the closer they came to understanding the political landscape surrounding the investigation, the farther away the final truth seemed to become. The silence that began on the morning of September 2nd, 1980, never truly ended. Instead, it expanded, becoming part of the history of Italy itself. When people first hear about the disappearance, the obvious question is usually the simplest one. What happened to them after they left the Triumph Hotel? It is a question that appears straightforward, but one that history has never been able to answer with certainty. Did they reach the meeting they intended to attend? Were they intercepted before they arrived? Were they questioned because of the subjects they were investigating? Or did events unfold in an entirely different way that has never been documented? More than 4 decades later, none of these possibilities has been proven. The available evidence simply stops after they entered a jeep and departed for southern Lebanon. In many criminal investigations, uncertainty gradually disappears as evidence accumulates. Here, the opposite occurred. Time provided additional political context, but almost no direct evidence concerning the disappearance itself. Every newly released document illuminated another corner of the historical background while leaving. The central event hidden in darkness. The result is an unusual imbalance. Modern researchers understand considerably more about the environment surrounding the journalist than investigators understood in 1980. Yet they remain unable to reconstruct the final hours of Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni with confidence. Perhaps this is what makes the case so enduring. It is not simply a story about 2 missing journalists. It is a story about the limits of historical knowledge. Human beings often assume that enough time eventually reveals every secret. Archives open. Governments change. Official records become available. Historians revisit old investigations with fresh perspectives. In countless cases, this process produces long-awaited answers. In the disappearance of Graziella and Italo, however, every step toward greater transparency also revealed how much had already been lost forever. The declassification of documents over the years illustrates this paradox perfectly. As materials became available in 2009, 2014, and again in 2022, they confirmed important aspects of the historical record. They demonstrated that Italian intelligence services had followed developments related to the case. They revealed shortcomings in the early investigation. They offered greater understanding of the political relationship between Italy and the Palestine Liberation Organization during that period. These disclosures mattered. They corrected misunderstandings, clarified historical context, and provided researchers with information that had remained inaccessible for decades. Yet none of those documents contained the answer that families had spent years hoping to find. No report identified the exact location where the journalists disappeared. No official record established who took them. No newly released file revealed where their bodies might be. No document transformed an investigative hypothesis into an established historical fact. Instead, every release reinforced a difficult reality. Governments can preserve diplomatic correspondence, intelligence assessments, and administrative decisions. They cannot necessarily preserve the truth about an event that unfolded beyond the reach of documentation. For the families of Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni, this distinction is far more than an academic observation. It defines decades of waiting without certainty. Every anniversary of the disappearance represents another year without confirmation. Another year in which the questions remain unchanged despite the passage of time. Grief usually follows a recognizable path when death is confirmed. There are rituals, funerals, memorials, and eventually some measure of acceptance. However painful it may be, A disappearance interrupts that process. Without certainty, grief becomes intertwined with possibility. Hope never entirely disappears because the absence of evidence is not the same as proof. At the same time, hope itself becomes exhausting when years become decades. The reopening of the investigation by the Rome Public Prosecutor's Office in 2019 demonstrated that. The search for truth had not ended. Even after almost 40 years, investigators remained willing to examine new material and reconsider existing evidence. That decision reflected more than legal responsibility. It acknowledged that unresolved cases continue to matter, regardless of how much time has passed. Justice does not become irrelevant simply because history grows older. Whether future investigations will ever resolve the disappearance remains impossible to predict. Responsible historical analysis demands restraint. There is no evidence permitting confident predictions about what future inquiries may uncover. New documents may emerge. Previously overlooked information may be discovered. Additional historical research may clarify aspects of the political environment even further. Or the mystery may remain exactly as it stands today, partially understood, extensively investigated, yet fundamentally unresolved. There is another reason this case continues to resonate beyond Italy. Graziella De Palo and Italo Toni disappeared while performing one of journalism's most essential functions. Attempting to understand complicated realities that powerful institutions often prefer to remain hidden. Their investigation focused on international arms trafficking, intelligence activity, relations between Italy and Palestinian organizations, and broader political dynamics connecting Europe with the Middle East. None of these subjects lends itself to simple explanations. Each involves competing interests, incomplete information, and decisions made far from public view. Their work reminds us that investigative journalism often depends upon patience rather than spectacle. Reporters gather documents, compare conflicting accounts, travel to unfamiliar places, and spend countless hours asking questions whose importance may not become apparent until much later. Most investigations never become famous. Many conclude quietly after publication. Some change public understanding of major events. A very small number become historical mysteries because the journalists themselves disappear before completing their work. Graziella and Italo belong to that final category. It is significant that discussions of their disappearance almost always return to one particular moment before leaving on what would become their final journey. They reportedly told personnel at the Italian embassy that if they failed to return within 3 days, someone should come looking for them. Those words have acquired extraordinary emotional weight over the years, not because they predicted the future with certainty, but because history transformed an ordinary precaution into a permanent reminder of everything that followed. One sentence, one departure, then silence. The silence itself became evidence, not evidence proving who was responsible, but evidence demonstrating how completely two experienced journalists disappeared from the historical record. There are cases in which history remembers victims primarily because investigators eventually identify those responsible. There are other cases where history remembers the unanswered questions more vividly than the crime itself. The disappearance of Graziella De Palo and Italo Toni belongs to the latter. Their names have become inseparable from one of Italy's enduring misteri d'Italia, not because the mystery overshadows their lives, but because it reflects the extraordinary intersection of journalism, diplomacy, intelligence, war, and state secrecy that surrounded their final assignment. Perhaps the most meaningful lesson offered by this case is also the simplest. Facts matter, especially when facts are incomplete. Throughout the decades, countless theories have attempted to explain what happened in September 1980. Some appear plausible. Others are far more speculative. Yet responsible investigation requires distinguishing clearly between documented evidence and assumption. That distinction protects not only historical accuracy, but also the integrity of those whose lives are being remembered. Graziella DiPaolo built her career on seeking verifiable information rather than accepting convenient explanations. Italo Toni spent years reporting from one of the world's most politically complex regions by carefully observing events as they unfolded. Their professional standards deserve the same respect in the way their own story is told. Today, visitors searching through archives will find official documents, investigative reports, and historical analyses. They will discover references to Lebanon's civil war, international arms routes, political relationships between Italy and the Palestine Liberation Organization, and the gradual declassification of state records. They will also encounter something much less tangible: absence. There is no final chapter explaining where the journalists spent their last hours. There is no courtroom verdict identifying those responsible. There is no confirmed resting place where history can quietly conclude. Instead, there's only a journey that began in Rome, continued through Damascus, reached the divided streets of Beirut, and disappeared into history. More than 40 years later, the final destination of that journey remains unknown. And until verifiable evidence answers the question that has endured since September 2nd, 1980, the disappearance of Graziella DiPaolo and Italo Toni will continue to stand as one of the most profound reminders that history is not always written by the evidence we possess. Sometimes it is defined by the evidence that vanished along with the people who were searching for the truth.